Rachel Tabachnick is a researcher and writer, and she's got some interesting information for us on Sarah Palin and the prayer warriors. Rachel, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you, Jen.
All right. First, what is a prayer warrior?
Well, a prayer warrior is a term that was developed by the leadership of the New Apostolic Reformation. It refers to networks that they have in each of the 50 states and also internationally. It's a way for this group of charismatics to communicate. But they've also, along with this, developed all kinds of new evangelizing techniques with the spiritual warfare, things called ground-level warfare, occult-level warfare, strategic-level spiritual warfare, spiritual mapping, and so forth.
All right. These guys sound crazy, but how many of them are there? Are there like 13 guys, and we just arrested 9 of them with the Hutari, or is it a significant portion of the population?
Well, according to C. Peter Wagner, the apostle who heads up this movement, he claims that they have 100 million people worldwide.
Okay, that's a lie.
In apostolic networks. Let me give you a little bit of background so this won't seem quite so mysterious. This is a movement that emerged out of the Pentecostal and charismatic stream of Christianity, which is the biggest, is the newest and one of the biggest mega blocks of Christianity. So we're talking about 500 million people. But inside of that mega block, you have a block of independent and post-denominational charismatics. Sometimes they're referred to as neo-charismatic or neo-Pentecostal. So what this is the New Apostolic Reformation is the movement that is organizing that block, the block of neo-charismatics. And over the last 20 years, in this block of neo-charismatics that are being organized under a network of apostles and prophets, they've developed all kinds of new, quite radical evangelizing techniques that are about taking control of geographic areas as opposed to evangelizing people one by one.
All right. Before we get into what it means to take control of the areas and how they're connected to Sarah Palin and all that,
okay.
I want to understand, again, how big they are, because I understand what you're saying, but look, here's how I interpret it.
Okay.
We got all these born-again Christians and evangelicals in the country. That's a big chunk of the country. I don't know if it's 20%, 25%, but it's a big chunk, right? But they're not all crazy, and they don't all, speak in tongues, which is more Pentecostal, etc., and believe in becoming occult warriors and taking over the country. But some of them do, and it's amazing how many of those there are. Is there any accurate way of gauging what subset of those evangelicals are these neo-charismatic, prayer warrior, etc.?
Now I can tell you that it's large and it's growing. And again, I'll just have to quote the leadership of this movement, which says that they are about the same size in this country as the Southern Baptist Convention. So if that is true, then they'd be talking about 15 million people.
All right. Now, let's get into how they're going to conquer the country. I'm a little afraid to ask. How are they going to do it?
Well, like I said, they've come up with a whole new genre of evangelizing techniques which have to do with taking territory as opposed to evangelizing one by one. Mm-hmm. And basically what this consists of is that they have set up these prayer warrior networks. They're in all 50 states. There's a network called the U.S. Global Apostolic Network and one called the U.S. Prayer Reformation Network, and they're led by apostles in this movement. But additionally, what they have done is they have set up what look like very benign prayer groups, pastors' prayer networks in cities all over the country, and they've become deeply, deeply entrenched in charitable activities, and also faith-based activities like Abstinence-Only teaching. Basically, the idea, C. Peter Wagner is the convening apostle, and what he says is that there's no need for a theocratic takeover of the country if they can do this through democratic means, through the democratic process. So the idea is if they expand their numbers enough in communities, they'll be able to take control of those communities. One of their biggest campaigns that they have going is something called Reclaiming the Seven Mountains campaign, or just the Seven Mountains campaign. And what this is a campaign to take over 7 areas of culture, which are government, media, arts and entertainment, education, family, religion, and business. And so their goal is that their apostolic network would go into each of these areas in order to have influence and then to gain control over those areas. And you can actually see the video that they have. If you Google Reclaiming the Seven Mountains of Culture, you can see the video where they talk about this.
Rachel,
go ahead.
Let me jump in there. First of all, if they think they have recaptured arts and entertainment, they have not. Okay,
I know they don't believe that they're there yet.
Okay, all right. So they're not quite there yet. Rush Limbaugh doesn't quite mean, and Fox News doesn't equal capturing arts and entertainment. But you mentioned that they're burrowing deep inside charitable organizations. My God, if all they did was burrow inside charitable organizations, that'd be great. Burrow away, right?
No, because here again, it's a way for them to gain influence. And they're very specific, and they write about the fact that this is a way for them to gain influence in government. So the more dependent the government is on them for their charitable activities, the more influence that they have and the more deeply entrenched that they are.
And then let's say their Seven Mountains campaign, their 7-Up/Mountain Dew campaign works, and they capture the government. What are they going to do with it?
Well, to give you an idea, one of the apostles who's had the most political exposure is Lou Engle. And I don't know if this is somebody that's familiar to you. Mm-hmm. But, for instance, Lou Engle, just before the election, held a stadium event in San Diego, before the presidential election, held a stadium event in Qualcomm San Diego Stadium in favor of Prop 8 against gay marriage. And this was a 12-hour event geared toward youth, and by the end of this event, he was calling for martyrs. Now, the same Lou Engle, who was calling for martyrs at that event, this past spring was at an event with Newt Gingrich and Mike Huckabee, where he anointed them. He laid hands on them and prayed for them, and this was an event that was broadcast internationally on God TV. And Lou Engle was also the person who led the prayers at the Prayercast event against health care in December that involved Michelle Bachmann, Sam Brownback, Jim DeMint, Randy Forbes, and some other religious right leaders.
Rachel, this is really important. When he says martyr, does he mean symbolically sacrifice your career, sacrifice your earnings? I don't know. Or does he mean literally martyr?
They were calling for martyrs. And there were kids there in T-shirts that said, "If I die, I die."
Okay.
This was calling for martyrs.
Okay, now that's where it gets really scary, because some people are taking that very literally, such as this Hutari militia, who thought that the government is coming and that the Christian thing to do is to pick up the sword, and they were going to go ahead and kill cops and try to start a war with the federal government. Should we be concerned that there are more Hutari groups out there being encouraged by this kind of martyr talk?
Let me point out that the similarities and the differences. There is an important similarity here. I think that most of us by now are familiar with the fact that there are a lot of Americans who believe in very literal end times prophecy. So they have this very detailed end time prophecy narrative that they believe is coming to pass imminently. Now, most of us see the end times narrative in which these born-again Christians believe that they'll be what's called raptured from the earth, which means, okay, these horrible end times are coming with the reign of the Antichrist and the end times wars, but Christians will be raptured and won't be here for all of that. What we see in the New Apostolic Reformation and the Prayer Warriors is a change in that end times narrative. They believe that they're not going to be raptured, not at that point anyway, that they will remain on earth during the rule of the Antichrist, and that they must prepare to fight literally. And so this is becoming a very common belief amongst the charismatics who are in this New Apostolic Reformation. They're rejecting the rapture idea, saying that's wimpy, that's defeatist. We're going to stay and fight the Antichrist ourselves.
I mean, Rachel, this sounds so absurd to a person who believes in logic. I mean, it's now there's a split between the people who think they're going to get vacuumed up into the sky and the ones that think that they're going to stay on Earth and fight the dwarves and the elves, and Gandalf and whatever else is coming. And so it sounds like it's the Star Wars guys versus the Lord of the Rings guys. But
you know, I'm sure that it does sound very bizarre to people who aren't accustomed to that culture. But at the same time, we got to keep in mind when we're talking about many millions of Americans. You turn on any TV in any place, and you can get CBN and TBN and God TV, and you can see people talking about this around the clock. And you can see news that's presented through the paradigm of these end times events. You can see Jack Van Impe and John Hagee talking
Rachel,
about today's events and how this plays in the imminent end times.
So let me explore that more, okay? Because Rachel Tabachnick is a researcher and writer on these issues, because this is not really in the Bible. I mean, the end times are in the Bible, like Armageddon's in the Bible, but the getting vacuumed up into the sky isn't there. Staying and fighting isn't there. I mean, these guys are just creating fantasies of their own. I mean, they got their own different kinds of Dungeons and Dragons. So who's the dragon layer here, or whatever, the dragon master? Who came up with this nonsense?
Well, now keep in mind that this very, very specific end-time narrative that you see, for instance, in the Left Behind books that sold 60-something million copies is fairly old. It dates to the mid-1800s, and what happened with that is that with the fundamentalist movement that took place in this country in the early 1900s, they used a Bible called the Scofield Study Bible, and it was a King James version of the Bible, but then down at the bottom of each page, it had all these notes that interpreted this for you. So, for instance, you would look down and you would see Gog and Magog refers to Russia. So all of a sudden, Russia is in your Bible, okay? And you go to the book of Revelation, and you would see that the Antichrist was going to emerge out of the emerging recurrence of the Roman Empire, and this would be in Europe. And so these notes were there. I have a 1917 copy of this study Bible. And so this is where Christian Zionism comes from, the John Hagee and the Christian Zionists who are rabidly pro-Israel but quite anti-Semitic at the same time.
Rachel, let's pause there for a second, because that's really important. So this Scofield Bible that came around in the mid-1800s, I think you're saying?
It became popular in the early 1900s.
Okay, early 1900s. Mm-hmm. So that's less than 100 years, or around 100 years ago, okay? The Scofield Bible has footnotes that explain all this Dungeons and Dragons stuff. That's not, so it'll say, like, here's the Bible, and you'll read the Bible, and it doesn't say that there's a giant Hoover vacuum sucking you up into the sky. But Scofield put a little note, and asterisk, and then you read at the bottom, oh yeah, when it says Gog and Magog, that means Russia. When it says end times, that means you get sucked up into the sky by a vacuum cleaner. And when it says this happens at Armageddon, that means Israel has to conquer all the land and kick the Palestinians out. Although, of course, at that time there was no Israel. But I know I'm oversimplifying it, but is that roughly what it is?
Well, this is how these end time narratives, the end time narratives that we have today, got started. Yes, they're a little over 100 years old. This particular version, there's always been end times narratives and Antichrist stories. But this one that became so fixed in American society dates to the mid-1800s, and then was passed along by American fundamentalists. Now, what we have right now is another huge change, though, I believe, in evangelical culture with this new apostolic reformation.
Right. So that splinter group that you explained, the prayer warriors, basically, who was their Scofield? Who came up with their voodoo?
Okay, it's a man named C. Peter Wagner, C being his first initial that he goes by, and he was a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary in Southern California for 30 years. And he was also involved from the beginning in the huge international umbrella evangelical association, the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization, that was put together by Billy Graham. So he's what you call a missiologist. He's a specialist in evangelical missions. And in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was a huge push to evangelize the entire world by the year 2000. And you can imagine for millennialists, the year 2000 had a huge significance. And so there was this huge push to evangelize the world. And C. Peter Wagner and some of his colleagues came up with these concepts of spiritual warfare in order to take large amounts of geographical territory at a time, or so they believed. Now, what this meant was the development of all kinds of demonology, of this strategic level spiritual warfare in which they would actually fight demons to try to remove demons from certain ethnic groups, communities, and geographic areas in order to try to evangelize those entire areas.
Did they have to remove any demons from white folks or no?
Yes. You know what's interesting about this? This is an extremely multiracial and multi-ethnic movement. It is so different in appearance from what we think of as fundamentalism.
Well, it's got an upside.
Men and women can be apostles and prophets. And this was why there was an objection. There was not objection from them for Sarah Palin to run as vice president.
And so when did C. Peter Wagner start this ball rolling?
Well, he got the ideas going by the late 1980s, and then in this frenzy of evangelism that I was talking about in the 1990s, these ideas spread not just through charismatics, but also spread to some of the breakoffs of the mainline Protestant churches, and also into other evangelical groups. But then what happened is that Wagner not only introduced new ideas and new ideology, but he introduced a new structure for what he described as the post-denominational church. And what that means is that this movement believes that denominations have to be eradicated and that the church of the end times will be united. And this is why they don't have a label for people to recognize. They don't want to be a denomination. They want to be the church of the end times.
I mean, as you lay this out, Rachel, and we're talking to Rachel Tabachnick, who's a researcher and writer in these areas, I mean, it sounds, of course, a lot like Al-Qaeda. I mean, I'll come out and say it, because they believe in being martyrs, they believe in violence, they believe in fighting demons, you know, and I'm not sure even Al-Qaeda is that crazy. I mean, of course, Al-Qaeda has committed much bigger atrocities, but I think they think they're actually fighting the West and not demons. And they've got sleeper cells. So
well, keep in mind at this point, the New Apostolic Reformation claims that they're fighting this in the spiritual realm, and so they make a big deal of saying that they're not actually going to hurt humans, that they're fighting this in the spiritual realm.
They're only going to hurt the demons.
But they've put out a lot of media, including something called the Transformations movies. This is another one of their big publicity tools, like the Seven Mountains campaign. And this is a series of movies that they put out beginning in 1999, where they showed the process through which they would transform. That's the buzzword, transformations. And so these movies were about how they would transform communities and entire countries. This is where Sarah Palin comes into the story, because before she ran for governor in Alaska, she was at Wasilla Assembly of God, where she went for about 20 years, and a Kenyan named Thomas Muthi came in and laid hands on her and what's called anointed her before she ran for governor. Now, this video ended up making the internet, and there was some attention paid to the fact that Thomas Muthi was someone who had expelled a witch from Kiambu, Kenya. Unfortunately, what didn't get out was that Thomas Muthi was a leader in an international movement and a star of the first Transformations movie, which is a publicity campaign for this movement.
See, I mean, I think these guys are the world's biggest goofballs. I mean, now they're in. I mean, it goes from movie to movie. It sounded like Lord of the Rings in the beginning. Then it sounded like Zombieland as they thought they were fighting demons. Now it sounds like Transformers. In the form of Sarah Palin.
You have to recognize that they now have a series of movies, transformation movies, which have been filmed in locations all over the world and are being
Megan
shown
Fox
to
in any of them?
churches and audiences all over the world, that this is a positive thing for them to do this spiritual warfare and spiritual mapping and to take control of communities.
All right, Rachel, so Sarah Palin gets this guy to lay hands on her, which sounds kind of dirty if you ask me. But anyway, so what happens next? Does that mean she's a spiritual warrior, she's part of a sleeper cell, or it's just some goofiness and it doesn't really mean anything?
Now, keep in mind, you're talking about sleeper cell. These people are not hiding anything about this. If you know what you're looking for, it's all quite out there in the open. They write about it openly in their books, of which they've written hundreds and hundreds. They have movies. Think of it as a denomination that doesn't want to see itself as a denomination. It's just not well known because it's not been labeled, I think, for one thing, and it doesn't fit in the paradigm of what we expect a church to be.
Right. And look, I think that they're insanely dangerous, not necessarily because they're going to do immediate violence now, and I hope they don't. Obviously, we should keep track of it. But that they want to start Armageddon, and they want to capture government to start Armageddon. I would call that fairly dangerous.
Let's go back to Sarah Palin for a moment. What we found in our research, my research colleague and I did quite a bit of work on this before the election. And what we found once we saw that Sarah Palin had a tie, her Wasilla Assembly of God, where she grew up, had a surprising number of connections to international leaders in the movement who were coming in and out of this church and speaking, which surprised us. So then we did a little more digging, and we found a tape from a conference by the leaders in the spring of 2008, where Mary Glazier, who is the lead apostle in Alaska, was speaking at the conference and said that Sarah Palin had joined her prayer warfare network, which Mary Glazier had started very early, when Palin was 24 years old. Mm-hmm. So she has been in this charismatic network for many years. And while they wouldn't admit it before the election, after the election, Charisma magazine, which is one of the lead magazines of the charismatic movement, even wrote about the fact that Palin had this relationship with Apostle Mary Glazier.
And
go ahead. Uh-huh.
And if in the end, finally, Sarah Palin becomes president, we finally get to the movie of Clash of the Titans, and she says, "Release the Kraken," and then it's over, right?
Well, I think we can learn a lot about what Sarah Palin believes and what her priorities would be by looking at the priorities of this movement. And if you read their books and you see what they're doing in places where they are transforming communities, it's quite clear that they do not believe in religious pluralism.
So, Rachel, I got to conclude here because we talked about this for a while. But so, in all seriousness, if one of these people were to become, gain a position of enormous power, like the commander-in-chief of the greatest army ever built by man, that would be the United States Armed Forces, is there some chance that they would really push towards going in a direction where we could facilitate Armageddon, or even they're not that crazy?
There's not a simple answer here. I think the movement is dangerous in the fact that their ideology is to demonize others. They literally will make spiritual maps and mark on the map who and what in their community is evil, and the demons that have to be removed for them to transform their community. This ideology makes them dangerous.
All right. Rachel Tabachnick, researcher and writer, knows a lot about this. And one thing I'm sure of is that the prayer warriors are not my folks. They are cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. And whether they're fighting demons or krakens or whatever the hell they think they're fighting, and they should be nowhere near any government office. And I don't, you say she started at the age of 24 with these guys. I don't know if Sarah Palin's one of them. There's a lot of reasons to be against her in the first place, but I suppose this would be another one if it turns out she's a sleeper cell, prayer warrior, Kraken releaser. But Rachel, very interesting information. Thank you so much for joining us.